Next is our panel discussion on Virtual Homo Sapiens, where will the human race end up with the metaverse? Let us introduce our distinguished panelists, starting with Anthony Berhan and Dr. Kanchal Tilakaratne, who you have already had the privilege of listening to as part of our keynote speeches.
Joining them, Shiv Malik, who is the author of 2 books, the co-founder of the Intergenerational Foundation think tank, an award-nominated broadcaster, and a former investigative journalist for The Guardian. After 4 years advising the Web3 projects Golem and Streamer and co-creating a revolutionary framework for monetizing personal data, he co-founded Pool in 2021 and currently leads the project on its mission to bring data unions to the world and ensure people have control of their data and a genuine stake in the digital economy.
We also have Sherry Ang, who is the country director of Google Cloud's business in Singapore and Malaysia. She is responsible for leading revenue and go-to-market strategy and operations for Google Cloud, and working with teams across Google to help customers in all industries reimagine their business through data-powered innovation.
Let me have the privilege to invite Professor Paul to guide and moderate today's panel discussion. He's not a new face for us in ADL, as well as the viewers who joined our very first AI forum last year in 2021. So global technology entrepreneur, ambassador at TM Forum, AI Big Data Analytics, CX, Smart Cities, and innovation, none other than Professor Paul Morrissey. He's passionate about education and seeks to enable people of all ages through the delivery of free lectures and short courses at many multi-territory universities and open forums. He's a globally renowned figure in the world of telecommunications and media. Let me warmly welcome Professor Paul and our dear panelists to start the panel discussion of the AI Forum 2022 Day 2. Professor Paul, over to you.
Thank you very, very much. Can everybody hear me? Just put your fingers up. Oh, great. Okay, I'm very, very proud to be able to host this session today. And the exam question that we have is, how do Homo sapiens and the human race, and where do we end up in the metaverse? Well, let's move back a little before we move forward. The metaverse is just really another incarnation of how humans interact with each other when they're not face to face. So we could say, telephony was the first incarnation of the metaverse. We've all been in an incarnation of the metaverse in the last couple of years. We're virtually talking to each other. Great example of where we are now. But then let's think about what happens when we move into the future. Where does it go from there? Let's start giving ourselves some intellectual challenges about, how do we then talk to each other? How do we interact with each other? So let's look forward. Oh, tell you what, let's not look forward. It's not just about looking. It's about feeling. It's about tasting. It's about smell. The metaverse enables us to look at all those senses in a different domain. So let's just think about where we end up before we decide where we've come from. This immersive technology is where we really want to make ourselves known and where we are. So there's a few things that will drive the metaverse. Data, of course, is one. Infrastructure is another. But bringing that technology all together, do we go to a place where Ray Kurzweil calls the singularity, where our technology actually is outstripping and out understanding us as a human race? So that could be dystopian or utopian. We have to put some rules around that before we start thinking about where we're going next. But it is interesting to think about. So where are we today? I've gone historical and I've gone future. Where are we today? Currently, most popular shared platforms, which we call metaversal, are games. And they're largely based on Web 2 infrastructure. They're centralized and generally are not interoperable. You can think about Fortnite, Minecraft, games like that, where actually there are 100 million daily users using those games. So gaming is probably ahead of us. But In the shared world of platforms, where people can be looking at interoperability, things like Second Life and Alt Space, there's around 40 million monthly users. So they're way behind in adoption, but there's no doubt that they're going to start catching up if we give them the environment, and a safe environment, as the doctors just talked about, to actually exist in. Facebook have rebranded as Meta, we all know that. And that is just one giant tech company that is putting billions of dollars into the future that we've just tried to describe. So when we move to Web3 platforms, the metaverse actually takes on, in my opinion, a new type of interaction. We start looking at people in different ways. We're looking at tokenization. We're looking at interaction and interplay. And these are things which we're only just touching the edges of. They'll become more mainstream and accessible over the next couple of years, and they will have no doubt massive benefits. We won't all be wearing goggles. As I said, we'll be actually immersed in this environment. Remote surgery, for instance. I mean, just take that as one example, where you are in a different place and controlling a robot to actually interact with an operation. That puts a whole new spin on network operations and the responsibility of network operations and the ethical responsibility of network operations. What do? Do you give bandwidth to that operation, or do you give it to a financial transaction? These ethical decisions are huge in our environment. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So the exam question of where will humans end up in the metaverse, I think we could go on for 5 hours. We've only got an hour and 15 minutes. So let's contain ourselves and let's see what we can talk about. But today's panelists are going to talk about that landscape and try and give it a bit more clarity. And we're going to look at, what's the role of the humans in there? How do different industries use the metaverse? It's not just about gaming. What are the risks and opportunities? Doctors talked a little bit about the cyber attacks, the adversarial attacks. What happens when we have quantum computing coming into this environment? Do we have quantum security? That's a whole new topic. So here to talk about that, we have our 4 distinguished panelists. I'm looking forward to this as a debate, a discussion, an interaction. And I'm going to hand it over now to our panelists to introduce themselves. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Anthony. Anthony, could you just give us a little bit of background about yourself and what you're going to talk to us about today?
Certainly, Paul. Pleasure to be here with you all this morning, and really looking forward to a fascinating discussion and great introductory comments, Paul. It really sets the tone. I obviously spoke a little bit earlier today, so people have seen me already, but just a couple more words about where I come from. So I've been 25 years in telecom, and most of that have been in data and AI. Apart from that, I do have a legal background, and so I've done a lot of work in privacy in particular, and so that's obviously something that Kanchana was talking about earlier. Very, very interesting presentation there as well. That's going to be really, really important. I've also done some academic research on, I finished an MSc there a few years ago on the politics of technology. And one of the initial comments that I made in my presentation was that all of this technology isn't new, along the lines of what you said there. Really, this is a human story, and it's about how we behave with the technologies that we have and how we evolve our interactions and our communications with one another, and that fascinates me. So when I talk about politics, it's not about sort of left versus right or political parties and all that sort of stuff. That's not what I mean when I say the politics of technology. I mean, it's about how humans organize themselves to take advantage of the technologies that we have and to make life better. To help fix the problems that we have, whether that's inequality or climate change or these different challenges that we face. Can we evolve as a species with the technologies that we have developed to become, in some sense, better and leave the place in a better state than we found it for our children in the next generation. So that's very important to me. So so background in telco and data and AI. So that's what I get paid for, and then in my private life, I think about those other things and how we might make them better.
Thank you, Anthony. I wish I got paid, but anyway, we'll move on. I'd like to introduce Shriv next. Shriv, could you give us a little background, painting of yourself, and we'll move forward from there. Great to have you on, by the way.
Hey, hi, Paul. Good to see you again. So I am Shiv Malik. I'm the CEO of Pool Data. What we do, very briefly, is we work in the sort of zero-party data space, which is essentially about getting people to positively opt in to monetizing, sharing their data, and building out the infrastructure necessary for that. In particular, in regards to this sort of conversation, what we're doing is building out a digital backpack, if you want. It's a data wallet, so it allows you to both pay and store your data. Of course, that data has to come from somewhere, and has to, if it wants to be read at scale, it has to be well governed, well structured. So those are the issues that we're kind of working with lots of other partners, these institutions called data unions, who are cropping up at the moment and helping people to actually structure that data and monetize it and share it. I'd like to take that question really and make it a bit more normative in a sense. And, where do we want to end up, if you want, with the metaverse? And will we kind of ever get there? So I would like to see a decentralized metaverse in many senses, where, it isn't just controlled by a couple of big players. And I mean that both in the infrastructure sense and the kind of consumer front ends. Both of those things are deeply important. But having worked in the smart city space for a year or two, you can see just how difficult it is to really deliver on those visions unless you've got those basic primitives in place. One of them is obviously how people bring data to the metaverse, because without data, how are you ultimately going to be known? How are you going to actually have services provided to you unless that data is delivered, if what we call sort of first party? So, it's sort of Google and Facebook saying, right, we have all this consumer data on people, we'll share it with various partners to ensure those services. I mean, sure, Sherry will like to have a response to that. Or you could do it another way where people bring their own data that they're storing and that they permission into the metaverse. That's the vision I think I'd like to see, perhaps many of the other panelists as well. So that's one of the primitives. And there are a few others. How do things get rendered in a decentralized way? That's probably very, very difficult. How is the rest of the cloud computing delivered in a sort of decentralized way? That might be very difficult. That hope that we can end up with, as sort of Anthony said, that kind of better future and technology delivering a better product. That I might be a bit pessimistic about at the moment.
On mute, Paul.
Sorry, thank you, Shiv. I'm on mute. That's a really interesting environment that you're describing there. And I think Web3 is going to bring us into that very quickly. So it's, if we look at the last generations and how things have changed from, Web 1 to Web 2, Web 3, I think, is coming all over us. And we need to start thinking about that and get regulation involved in it. So Sherry, do you want to give us a little bit of thought around yourself and what you're playing in this environment?
Thanks, Paul. So I believe we're standing on a really, really exciting times. Our whole industry is on the cusp of a very major shift. Currently, I lead Google Cloud in Singapore and Malaysia. And in that capacity, I really have that privilege of working with government institutions, private organizations in accelerating digital transformation, and really get to see, firsthand innovation at its best, organization orchestrating ourselves in solving some of the biggest societal challenge, and also addressing some of the promises that we're going to talk about today at metaverse conversation. From my perspective, I've spent about 25 years in tech MNCs, started my journey with telco, and just as Shiv and Anthony has said, it's really an evolution of human interactions with technology. I started, putting wireless network in 2G, 3G space across Asia. And it's very, very exciting to see this new space emerging. For me, I look at the future with this lens that it's going to be a very exciting tech-enabled world where 3Ds are going to play a very, very key role. One is digital, and in the arena of digital, we are seeing the breaking down of boundaries of that was put in place in the past by geographies or industry boundaries. So digital is going to create a very big shift, and we're seeing that in the metaverse, for example. I think a lot of the speaker talks about data and AI. The role of machine learning is going to increase with the capacity, the volume and variety of data that are coming as we interact in the digital space. And I really like what Shiv said, it's going to be a world of democratized environment, of a decentralized view. We also at Google interact with a lot of startups, that are building on various types of innovation. And recently, Google published, along with Bain, as well as Temasek, a e-economy report. And as much as we are seeing the onslaught of geopolitical, economic, macroeconomic conditions, we're still seeing a lot of promise where venture capitalists are willing to put money and funding behind the whole arena of Web3. And Paul, you rightly said that in your introduction, we're going to see a lot that is going to be evolved in terms of investment into Web3, driving the innovation that is going to allow and lay a strong foundation and infrastructure for people to build innovations. And the Web3 infrastructure is going to be very different. It's a primarily blockchain-driven arena. And at Google, we're really excited to be focused on how can we help, be a catalyst in creating that digital infrastructure, in also empowering the Web3 developer so that we can see more creativity, more solutions that are brought forward for this new promise.
Well, thank you very much. We're very excited by that, and thank you for joining us today. Okay, finally on our panel, we have Cloudera, and we just heard your discussion, Doctor, but could you just give us a little bit of an elaboration of where you think all the security, privacy is really going to end up in the universe? It underpins everything we've got in the metaverse, in my opinion. So, as I said before, quantum security is something which baffles me. It's in my mind all the time now. Looking at a few startups in California actually working on it now. So, could you just give us a view of yourself of where security is going to go in the metaverse and what your thoughts are?
Yeah, sir, it's an honor to be in this panel, and Paul, sir, I've been working on, privacy and security for some time. And then I remember, let's say 10 years ago, I was trying to build a decentralized social network, for example. So going down the path of Shiv earlier mentioned that, okay, we want to decentralize everything. But at that time, there were a couple of startups as well. Myself tried to build a startup around that, had an application that can they directly share content with other users, directly to the other user's phone without any central storage. And there are many startups were trying to do the same thing, but it never really materialized. Okay, so at the end, so still the big tech companies, managed to keep their control over social networking domain. But I still believe, and most of my work as well is that, okay, we need to bring the power of computation from this central node to close to the user as much as we can, when very close down to the end user device. So because of this, sometimes it could be financial constraints that, okay, everyone develop these applications to earn money and to develop business around that. So therefore, if we, let's say, I still feel that achieving full decentralization will be a big challenge. Okay, but then one of the alternative that we can do is to bring the control closer to the end user device and provide the control, as much as control, back to the end user. So maybe it's a centralized service, but the amount of data that goes out from the user's control, user's environment, user's protected area is going to be very minimal. So, so I would like, in future metaverse development to be, adapt to that kind of strategy. Okay, so right now it's quite open, and when it comes to privacy and security, we have not thought about what to do, because many startups and tech companies are still scrambling with making it work. And so then privacy and security has proven to be an afterthought in the industry. But what I was saying even in the keynote before is as well, so we can't go on and on like that. So we need to bring that into the picture from the get-go. And so right now, I think we all need to wake up and then start thinking about security and privacy in metaverse domain. And we, for example, what Paul mentioned about quantum crypto, for example, many modern day encryption methods might not be useful. They're kind of breakable when it comes to quantum computing. But there are other academics and researchers and other organizations working on quantum safe security technologies, for example, quantum safe cryptographic algorithms, for example. Those things, they're kind of horizontally applicable across all different domains, not just metaverse, but it will be essential for all other domains as well. And there will be such technologies that we certainly need to adapt throughout the internet. But when we also need certain technologies specific to metaverse. Okay? So that's what we got to start thinking about, because there could be certain security challenges, adversarial attacks that are unique to metaverse that we have not yet seen or not have experienced. Okay, some of these things, okay, right now it's hard to imagine as well. Okay, but we have different forms of metaverse with us today. Okay, with like augmented reality and mixed reality forms. So I think we need to leverage what we have right now and further investigate what could be the challenges, security challenges in the future. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Doctor. That was a real insightful view of where we are with this. I'm particularly interested in quantum security. I think it's an area which is amazing. We all tend to think of the metaverse as something we can play around in, but there is an industrial metaverse as well. What that plays in, the space that plays in. We're not looking through goggles, we're actually seeing these things in front of us when we're decoupling something like an engine, and somebody is working on it and they've got a holograph of the engine next door. I'm not going to pinch your thunder here, Anthony. So I'd like Anthony to talk a little bit about the industrial metaverse rather than everything we think about, which is the playful metaverse. Over to you, Anthony. You're on mute.
Yeah, no, the perennial challenge of our age. The industrial metaverse is a phenomenal thing. I just want to, before I go into that, I just want to respond to just some of the things that the other panelists said just about decentralization a couple of times. I think the idea of decentralization is intrinsically attractive to all of us. As human beings, as individuals, we want our own autonomy, we want our own freedom and so on, but our experience has been a little different. And, you know, if I can take just two examples, just first of all from the energy industry, and you know, our decisions on, say, nuclear power versus solar power as sort of centralized and distributed power structures. That nuclear power is obviously something that's very highly intensive and a strong, heavy engineering type exercise, requires extraordinary amounts of capital and government support, whereas solar is entirely the opposite in all of those categories. And you know, we have chosen nuclear over solar historically. We're trying to reverse that now, and it's challenging to sort of get away from that. In the internet itself, then of course, if you go back to the origins of the internet, if you go back to the Whole Earth Catalog and the Well in sort of the 60s in California and how all of that began, there was a real ethos of, I guess, libertarianism. It was certainly, you know, individual autonomy and freedom and so on that sort of was trying to drive highly distributed resource structure as computing came of age, as it were. And over time, that developed into a phenomenal and a wonderful a creative experience around in the 1990s in particular. But of course, we've ended up with a very centralized internet, in that, you know, for many people in the world, Facebook is the internet, period, or Google, Sherry, is the internet. There are one or two or three major islands in the internet, and that is the extent of our internet. So it's become a very centralized thing. And as we move into the metaverse, you know, I can't really see a change happening that would facilitate that kind of innovation that says we're going to go back to a decentralized space. And hence my comments earlier on in my presentation when talking about Web3, that I was a little bit skeptical about whether that kind of autonomy could be realized given where we are in the current moment globally. So anyway, that's my just 2 cents on decentralization. But to go back to your question, Paul, on the industrial internet, you know, 100%. Again, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think we're going to see many metaverses. We're going to see industrially focused metaverses and brand focused metaverses potentially. I think, you know, we're not going to see a single metaverse controlled by a single company or a single entity or even some, you know, committee or something like that everybody subscribes to. I think we have some fundamental protocol level standards that are important. We have the ITU that will continue to be relevant, the International Telecommunications Union. We have the GSMA and a couple of other organizations like that help us to define fundamental standards that are important for interoperability at a relatively low level. But fairly quickly, once you elevate above that, you're going to start to see diversification. I think, you know, I mentioned a couple of the industries earlier in my talk. I was talking about, you know, maybe Disney and children's entertainment or telcos indeed for regional or localized metaverses, and I think that they're important. But if I can talk about three specific applications just a little bit. The first one is collaboration, and I think that that's really important. We've been moving towards collaboration for a long time, and we're getting better at it. This is a fantastic experience, right? This here today, us speaking, hundreds, maybe thousands, I'm not sure how many people are watching. Potentially the entire world could be on YouTube watching this right now. So, I'm not sure what that would do to the Google service, sure, you can tell me, but the scale is just eye-watering. It's just, so the potential for our collaboration today is great. It's video, it's audio. Back in the 80s and 90s, we developed video or voice conferencing. There were lots of attempts to try and do video conferencing, in the 90s and 2000s. It was very weak. Chat groups and chat forums and all that sort of stuff, came of age in the 2000s and so on. We've been trying to do more and more integrated communications and trying to make those communications more effective, more reliable, more intimate. And today we have, pretty good stuff. The immersive metaverse will take that on a step further. And I think that's going to be, I don't like this idea of a killer app, but I think that that's going to be something that drives a lot of innovation. A lot of enterprises in particular will invest in improved collaboration. So I think that that's a really important one. Gaming, I think, is really interesting in terms of where it's going, not just because of the metaverse, but because of some of the other things that have already started to happen in terms of in-game commerce, in-game advertising, and games as a platform environment, not just for actually actively playing games, but just for hanging out, just for being a place where you can go and meet people, where you can experience, you can have different kinds of experiences. You can go shopping, you can not just for digital goods. And so I think we're already starting to see the gaming environment, whether that's, metaverse with a set of VR goggles or something, or just simple, PlayStation type engagements, where you're already starting to see very rich experiences beginning to happen. I think the first tweak I had of that was when Google bought, or Amazon bought Twitch for, I think it was a couple of $1 billion, like 10 years ago, something like that. It's phenomenal. This is a streaming platform for people who watch other people playing games. And it still blows my mind that it was $2 billion back then. It's probably significantly more than that now. But the point is that games aren't just about playing games. Games are a social experience. And within that experience, you can, there's a lot of different things you can do. And then the third thing is retail. And, retail, we're already seeing a lot of retail businesses exploring and experimenting. You've got Adidas, Hilfiger, Gucci, HSBC, and the banking side, JP Morgan. They're already they already have established metaverse environments. They're trying to figure it out. I'm almost certain that their metaverse presences are going to be completely different in 2 years' time. It's very much an experimental phase. All of those brands, I didn't check this, but I'm willing to bet that all of those brands had a significant presence in Second Life as well, 15 years ago or whenever that was. And so, and they're not there anymore. I haven't checked that either, but I'm willing to bet that they're not there anymore. So, these new technologies, they come on board, and we experiment with them, we try them out, we see what might work, and we evolve a kind of a model that might be suitable. But I think every enterprise is going to be thinking about how they can accelerate their digital transformation, to use 2022 language, using the tooling of the metaverse, how they can improve automation, how they can use AI to improve customer experience. And if the metaverse can help them to do that, then they're going to be in for that.
Thank you, Anthony. Lots of things to think about there. As always, when you leave it all on the table. Doctor, can we talk a little bit about what the metaverse is, or what students and academia are looking at in the metaverse? Are they excited by it? Not just for the gaming, by the whole domain. So I'll leave you to talk to us through that a little bit.
I think they are, but before I get into that, I would like to add maybe education could be another industry as well, because education and training. So the last 2 years, I know we kind of accelerated, leapfrogged like 10 years, like in terms of education and teaching, in terms of remote teaching, right? So now we're teaching, like myself teach now over 200 students every week, doing lectures, live lectures. They're not all in Australia, so they're in different parts of the world. So, right now, I guess the main challenge there is, the fairness. So everyone doesn't have a MR capable or like a virtual reality kind of device with them. But 10 years ago, we also did not expect that everyone has a laptop. Every student has a laptop. Nowadays, every student has a laptop. So we might come to a time in future that everyone has a VR headset with them. So then, we will have real opportunities in education and training with metaverse. So I'm really excited to, really experience that in education and teaching. Now, comes back to, what we are interested in. We are interested as academics. Yes, there is significant interest in all different domains. So I talked a lot about privacy and security earlier, but academics are really interested in performance and developing new technologies to really realize metaverse when it comes to, whether it's better networking technologies, and, there are a lot of work going on in academia to reduce latency in metaverse kind of applications, because latency is probably the most critical thing. Probably capacity can be improved, it can be handled even in the current context, because we're not really overloaded networks with metaverse like applications yet, but the latency is even right now a problem. So there are a lot of work going on, with distributed computing and edge computing, and how edge computing can be supported in terms of delivering metaverse-like services. And then there are a lot of other work in human-computer interaction domain. So they're really interested in metaverse, and while also developing devices that can interact with the real environment, and also certain devices that can interact with virtual environment. For example, you mentioned smell earlier. Probably you didn't mention, but also taste as well. So I have seen, academics working on devices that you can, in a way, teleport the taste into a different environment. So at CI researchers, there's significant interest in HCI community in metaverse. And then we have, this machine learning and AI development that kind of keep going, and it's kind of, in a very exponential, we have seen exponential growth over the past few years, that not really attached to the metaverse, or they're not really talking about, oh, we are doing this for metaverse, but metaverse is going to get benefit from the development of machine learning and AI. For example, if you go look at academic, let's say, computer vision conferences, a lot of work in 3D point cloud analysis these days. So that's all at the end is going to, support the development of metaverse in the future. So, and then security and privacy has only started, we started thinking about it probably 2-3 years ago. And it's very early stages when it comes to security and privacy. So
okay, that sounds great, actually. And thanks for giving us that insight. That I did miss taste out. You're right, but all of our senses will be exposed in the metaverse, I think. So, based on that, Shriv, can I ask you about the place of data, and particularly what you were talking about, that's zero-party data, and how we as humans have control over our data. The data at the moment, I think it's right to say that the institutions that are collecting our data are really only custodians of it. They don't own it. I know they do act sometimes as if they own it, but they don't. They are custodians of it. But I think what we're talking about here, and what I'd like you just to expand on, is the reversal of that ownership back to its fundamental source, and how you see that moving forward.
Yeah, so I'll take that first, and then I just wanted to add something back to the kind of the conversation that I opened up, a can of worms with the decentralization stuff. But okay, so for me, I think control is really important, and there's a lot of discourse, interestingly, kind of Europe and Germany, especially driven by kind of the German discourse about a real worry around the ownership of data, right? So it's all about who controls it, and it's actually very difficult to kind of, in a sense, own data from a theoretical perspective. You just copy and paste it in lots of different places. It suffers from that in that regard. So the problem is that ordinary people don't really have control of their data because they have no mechanisms to control it. And they don't have their own, as I said, sort of digital vault. Now, where we're getting to, interestingly, in Europe, so in March 2024 is kind of D-Day, or kind of Data Freedom Day, if you want, for this kind of reckoning that's been a long while coming. And what they've said is that they said that all the major platforms, the kind of gatekeepers, as they're known in this new piece of legislation called the DMA, it's a really large piece of legislation, and this is just one part of it. They've said that 450 million people in Europe will now get updated GDPR rights for data portability. So today, if you want data portability, you have to kind of email, and then you have to wait 30 days and say to whomever platform you want to go to, and they will eventually send you a file over email. And all of this was written back in kind of 2016, before GDPR got implemented, and that's how things work then. What the update is, now you can do it in real time. So in the way that you sign in with Google or Facebook or Microsoft or whatever it might be, you now just use that OAuth system to say, right, I want my data in real time, and I can port it to any other third party I choose. That's a real game changer, right? And it's a bit like open banking systems, if you're familiar with them in Europe. And actually there's a commercial equivalence in the US, because people have realized if you can get people to swap out their data suddenly and move it from one platform to another in a really consumer-friendly way, i.e. just a couple of clicks of a button, suddenly the whole economy grows. And yes, it might not benefit one player, but it will benefit everyone else. So that's really, I think, going to be a massive game changer for the metaverse, for those basic primitives about data control. Just to come back to that other discussion about kind of, again, what we want to see. I think, Twitter has been very salutary at the moment, and what's going on with Twitter, right? It's perceived by its own users to be an open and common space for sharing information, right? As a kind of metaverse primitive, it is very basic. People just have pictures and that's it. So it doesn't really qualify for that, for sure. But how people want that public space to be treated versus how this now very singular owner, Elon Musk, is now treating it, I think will give you a great insight into those debates as to how we should treat the metaverse, right? And how consumer reactions, and expectations will really bristle up. And I think that's been the story for the last decade against the people who actually, in law, and in terms of making the decisions, actually kind of, vie up against that. And so, for me, just one last thing on that is to say, for me, the first experience of that was really the Huffington Post, right? So everyone was sold on a dream that, if you contribute towards this common space by providing content and writing for it, you could reach the world, you can really get your voice out in a way that you just couldn't before because it was kept by, major newspapers. And then, of course, I think it was in 2011, or maybe 2010, Arianna Huffington then sold the Huffington Post, made and her investors made, I think, 300 million at the time. And everyone who contributed felt cheated. And my fear is that we end up again with the same thing again and again and again. And the metaverse is just a new frontier for that kind of long con. And so you really need to start right from the beginning on the ethics side, with basic principles and actual forms of common control. And that's the bit that I fear that we're not going to get, because the technology doesn't lend itself to just that. It's much easier to deliver the metaverse through centralized servers and, you know, a small team of dedicated professionals who are really well incentivized than, you know, big, and I come from the Web3 community, than big web sprawling, decentralized communities trying to, because the protocols are just so complex to deliver. So anyway, that's, I guess, a sort of that take on decentralization again, keep coming back to it. So apologies, Paul, I know you want to move it.
No. This is a great, as you know, this is a topic that consumes me a lot. But we also need, yeah, go on, Jeff, go.
Well, I was going to say one thing, the weak spot is in fact the data, right? That's actually why I'm working in that problem space, is because without the data, none of this really functions. Without people actually coming with that kind of rich digital story, right? You certainly don't get more than one metaverse, right? So if you want competing metaverse, people have to come with the data. And I think for me, that's the weak spot in there. I can't see how decentralization really works, except with people saying, no, I'm going to gatekeep my own data. So, you know, now I have some leverage at this table.
Do people care enough, Shiv, if you don't mind me asking? I mean, do people care enough to manage their own data, or?
No. They don't care enough to manage their own data. No one wants to. I don't want to manage my own data. I mean, like, you know, I've got too many things going on in my life for that, right? Right. It needs to be super convenient, incredibly well incentivized. It needs to actually give you something rather than just being another managerial task in your life. So, I mean, that's why, I mean, we can talk about sort of data union primitives, but there are lots of them around. Honey is a good example, right? Or kind of a basic version of that. Share your information and we'll give you real-time discounts and coupons. We'll actually get our AI to work for you, right? And, you know, they've got 17 million users, and I think they sold out to PayPal for 4 billion. Again, because PayPal are interested in the data, right? And that sort of aspect of it.
But it's interesting. I read a paper the other day where somebody was hypothesizing that everybody in the world has got about £10,000 worth of data a year owned by themselves. So that economy is just untapped. But let's move on, because I don't want to, we've got to draw this to an end sometime. But one thing that we haven't talked about is the technology enablement of this. So Sherry, could you talk to us about, you know, how at Google you are looking at not only, you know, the collection and sort of articulation of this, but actually putting it in place. And I love the fact that you are telecom biased as well. So, you know, those two technologies need to be interlinked to make sure that anything we do works, but this in particular. So over to you, Sherry. You're on mute, Albert.
Thank you, Paul. It's a very intriguing discussion. I wanted to kind of like jump in on the many different fronts. Before I go on to the technology first, I just want to respond quickly about the role of data, right? I think with Web3, the technology, of course, and I'll talk briefly about that shortly, but it's also the changing business model that is enabling, you know, the user who generates the data basically to actually get an opportunity to be able to monetize, in that sense, the data that they contribute to the entire economy. So I think there's quite a bit of a interesting change from that perspective that's happening in the market. From a technology front, I guess one of the key enablers of the metaverse experience is coming from the baseline. Of course, you know, the devices, the AR, VR, ambient computing, and the kind of devices that enable us to enjoy those experiences is going to be core and critical, and we see a lot of improvements. as we speak. But underlying at Google Cloud, we're looking at how do we empower and enable Web3 technologies from being the critical baseline infrastructure where organizations build their metaverse or their digital or virtual experience in that sense. So we've been dedicating basically Web3 teams to go out there and support our customer in building and deploying products, primarily on the blockchain-based platforms. Of course, this is leveraging on kind of like a global cloud infrastructure that can then cater to the high computing requirements and the latency that's needed in the virtual experience, right? We talk a lot about being real time, having that immersive 3D experience, being able to move across the physical and the real time, physical and the virtual experience. So that global infrastructure from a cloud computing to be able to provide that low latency across the world is going to be super critical. The other very important layer, I think we talk a lot about that, is at Google, we look at, how does BigQuery, very, very popular tool that Web3 developers use, and Looker provide the ability for data, AI, and machine learning. And here we're talking about, high capacity, high compute requirement, machine learning capabilities that are actually driving significant improvements and adoption in industrial use case, as Paul, you alluded to that earlier. For example, let me give you a very good example from a healthcare perspective. One of our partners, Zulik Pharma, has just announced their presence in the metaverse, primarily coming from the perspective that they believe the labor and human intensive pharmaceutical environment will get a lot of efficiency. They call it the metaverse efficiency, out of bringing some of their enablement training as well as experimental work into the metaverse environment. So in that sense, Google Cloud is really looking at how do we provide that massive scalable, very, very important. Dr. Kanchana talks about secure infrastructure that is low latency. And in the Web3 environment, it's a very complex ecosystem. And we're looking at multiple fronts of different ecosystem working together, and which is why the whole concept of collaboration, as Anthony rightly pointed, and openness of the platform with an ability to adopt open source technology and ultimately that is scalable and secure. So in the Web3 arena, we look at many players, right? All the way from layer 1 or layer 0 to start, where infrastructure like Google Cloud is providing the computing, the telcos, for example, are continuously enlarging their capacity for connectivity, or even, more efficient, cost-efficient connectivity, for example. We see new players coming in to build layer 1 infrastructure or foundations. How do they build the different nodes and programming to enable, layer 2 to build services, on the blockchain. There is a huge, because of the need for capacity building through collaboration, through different parts of the player bringing their different values into the whole ecosystem to make this whole metaverse comes to life. I think the API layer is going to be a very, very play a very significant role. And at Google, we are really looking at how to make the API management and exchanges as seamless and as easy as possible, so that we can allow many, we use the word democratize, citizen innovation and creativity, for example, with the API management through APG. We're seeing how people can bring data in and out in a very seamless, secure, as well as speedy manner. Then of course the whole world is exploding with creativity in layer 4, where we are seeing a lot of users in the Web3 world. We call it the D-apps, the new type of digital wallets and browsers are all over the place. It's a very, very exciting world that we see that a lot of things are still forming. I'm always saying that we are looking at, every one of us participating in the creation of the new world that we're going to very soon enjoy and live in. So I think complex environment forming would be the word, and it's an environment that we look to, openness and collaboration.
Well, that's great, and I think that's music to Shiv's ears. If we're going to have real-time APIs where we can take data out, and the European Union will be applauding you. Okay, so I think we've talked a lot about a lot of subjects here, but one that I think we've left on the table is the ethics of this environment. How do we look at instilling ethics into a metaverse that is, a bit of the Wild West at the moment, as far as I can see? How do we take on the trolley problem, for instance? I think I gave a little example of the trolley problem before when I'm saying, as a network provider, and you have to be able to give bandwidth to one thing or another, who makes that decision? We're putting it into machine learning and AI at the moment, but those decisions need to have some ethical content in it. I'm one for one. I think that most of these large organizations need some sort of philosopher in their sort of use case analysis. So I'm going to throw that around to all of you. What are your thoughts about, I'll start with you, Anthony. What are your thoughts about how we instill ethics into this environment? Because as we move forward and we move towards, dare I say, general artificial intelligence, transhumanization, if you like, we have to have this human ethical component in our technology.
Yeah, I love this topic because it really brings us back to first principles in terms of what's really important. And I've said it a couple of times. This is a people thing. Getting into this, we talked earlier about the importance of taste and smell as being representative of the real world, and sort of we're trying to transpose that. There's a book I want to just plug. It's called Smellosophy, and it's a fascinating read. It's by a woman.
Did you write it?
No, not at all. No, that book is still in draft form and won't come out for another 15 years. No, when we think about the real world, we think about sight and we think about sound, first of all, and our machines, our computers and our sensors prioritize those things over everything else. But our lived experience is very different. And so most of you, I'm sure, will have had the experience of a smell triggering a very vivid memory in your head of your grandmother's kitchen, or, something at school, or, and it's the smell that triggers it. It's not the words that describe the event or a picture, it's the smell. It's a strange kind of a feeling when that happens. It's a very not just a deja vu sense, but almost a sort of a time travel sense. So these are very important parts of what it means to be human, and making sure that we recognize that when we try and recreate virtual worlds is going to be really important, because it will always be that element of the unreal about virtual reality ad infinitum, I would hope. But on the ethical problem, you mentioned philosophy. I'll drop a couple of philosophers' names. Ludwig Wittgenstein had this theory of communication as a form of life. And what he meant was that, life in and of itself isn't self-contained, right? That we have to relate to the outside world. And it is our communication, our communicative capacity that actually represents life. And there was a philosopher of technology called Langdon Winner that took that on in the 1970s, and he talked about technology as a form of life. And really you can see those kind of theories in our thinking about the metaverse and what that means. Because when we think about the metaverse and virtual reality, we're talking about creating an environment within which we express ourselves as human beings. And there'll be a lot of talk about commercial stuff, and there'll be a lot of talk about technology stuff, but really it's about what it means to live. It's about consuming services. It's about engaging with other people. And so, and all of these things we've been doing, since the dawn of man, and today, and over time, we've developed an ethics of society. We've adopted a humanist ethics that allows us to interact socially with people, and we've translated that in politics and laws and all that sort of stuff. And so we have to see those ethics kind of translated into our technology, into our technical realization of the world as well. It's a real challenge.
It absolutely is, and thanks for that, and thanks for the reading material. I'll put that in the chat, please.
It's your homework, Paul.
Yeah. Well, I did that as an exam question. Okay, Doctor, what about your thoughts, ethics within the academia, and how we're going to push that into teaching, and we'll teach people about what this is all about?
Yeah, sir. What I would like to add there is, in metaverse, there are many decisions. The computers are going to take many decisions, and algorithms are going to decide what to do. Like as your example, how the spectrum management, so it comes down to that level of detail. So this algorithm will decide which spectrum that you're going to use, for example. So then, so there's a whole range of work these days now on, you probably have heard, around ethical AI, explainable AI, responsible AI. So, if you all remember, so maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when deep learning suddenly was producing remarkable results, people really struggled to explain why, how. Okay, but now we can't keep going on like that. So, if we want to move on with proper, developing ethical solutions, we need to understand why this particular AI algorithm, ranked a certain user ahead of another user, for example. Okay, why a certain algorithm decided that, okay, this is a malicious content, not the other one. Okay, and so there are research going on in that space, and I think that will lead us to better developed, a more fair metaverse in future. And then the second thing I want to add is, so when it comes to ethics, I think we need to back it up with proper regulations. For example, when it comes to regulations like GDPR, I believe in Europe significantly improved in terms of how companies make decisions, how companies treat user data, and how they're going to communicate with users about what they're going to do with their data if they're going to collect data. So we need technologies like responsible AI technologies plus proper regulations.
Okay, I couldn't agree with you more. And that starts inside as well as outside. So, Sherry, I've got to ask you this question. The chief ethics officer, how do we deal with ethics at a shareholder board level? Do we have an independent chief ethics officer? And if so, do we give them the ability to dictate our ethics?
Yeah, Paul, I think I'm going to disappoint you a little bit with this response. I think the whole possibility of metaverse, right, really falls into the realm of how new frontier technology will transform society at large. When you're talking about new frontier technology of the scale that is going to have major impacts on different facets of society, unfortunately, it's not a simple question. It's not a simple equation. And I would say in the fronts of ethics, we absolutely have a lot, I would think that technology is far advanced, in a stride, but from a arena of ethics and regulatory framework and governance, there's still a lot of work just because of the complexity. So I would advocate, given the complexity and the scale of collaboration that is needed, there has to be increased conversations between governing officials, the governments, the different types of agencies, and we're not even talking about like one arena of a technology council of ITU, for example. We're talking about technology council, we're talking about cybersecurity agencies, we're talking about central banks, financial and fiscal policy, because those will all have a hand into how capital is allocated. And when you start to define how capital is allocated, what's acceptable practices, that would then drive in down to how the real world economy is going to react. Where do we build services and solutions? It's going to be a very complex conversation and collaboration.
I completely agree with you. This is complex, and can regulation move at the speed of technology? And I think we all know the answer is no. So do we need to pair back that with our technology? I happen to sit on a UK House of Lords committee, which is looking at governance in Web3 and the metaverse, trying to make at least some basic understanding of safety and transparency. But I know this is a subject very close to your heart, Shiv. So, the ethics of where this data lies or this privacy lies, and how we actually instill that into the Web3 economy. Do you want to just take a few minutes on that?
Yeah, you put this all on my shoulders, Paul. Thanks. No, I'll try and stick to the metaverse aspects of it. And I'd say, look, this isn't, I think, the trolley problem is interesting, but actually it's the trolling problem that will probably arrive almost certainly first. If we look, let's try and again, search for things that look similar to what we'd like, or not we'd like to see, but we think it might end up like. So gaming communities are very, I think they're actually pretty developed forms of the metaverse. If you've done multiplayer gaming, you've got people speaking to you in a headset. You're talking back to them. You're in this wonderfully, amazingly rendered world. If you've ever kind of played Call of Duty or these kind of shoot 'em up games, right? These things are absolutely stunning. Often delivered, again, as Kanchan said, it's like at the edge, right? So people have got their game console in their house. It's right there, they're literally touching it. So that's very interesting. And how does it play out in terms of ethics? Well, I guess, yes, there's lots of people who, you get sworn at and you get trolls and, people butt up against each other. There are good reputation systems, or not good, but there are reputation systems. So a centralized party can just kick people out of there. But in the end, people think, well, it's just a game, right? So how far can this really affect the rest of the world? And it's kind of how we thought Twitter and Facebook would be, people just sharing cat memes and isn't this funny? And then suddenly, of course, information flows start to affect an election outcome, or election outcomes around the world, or people put out a tweet and it affects, stock prices by billions. You're like, oh, hang on, this does have serious effects. So, one other element to say to that is that it's now taken, we're like on year 12. If we take 2010 as the starting point for when social media should have been on every politician's radar, we're still 12 years later. We haven't really got anything comprehensive, certainly not in Europe or America, on how social media should be regulated, because it's incredibly thorny. I fear it'll probably be the same with the metaverse. People go, well, let's just, these are startups, let them be, let the space develop. I've seen it with we've all seen it with Web3. And I've advocated for some of those arguments, like, let's not have too much regulation. So I think, agree with the rest of the panelists in that sense. We certainly need deep ethical protocols that are actually agreed by everyone from the get-go. Let's not make the same mistakes that we did with social media and also Web3 and the crypto community. Let's start off with signed up protocols, because they'll take a couple of years to develop anyway. They won't be great. They may not be brilliant. They might be, they'll almost certainly not be fully comprehensive, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but we'll have something, right? Something to start with. And I think that I'd certainly advocate for that. And the only last question would be, is it industry-led and it's just sort of self-regulated, which actually would still be better than Web3 at the moment, or the crypto community, or is it from government top down? And at the moment, I'm sort of equivocal, but maybe the other panelists will have thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, well, we're getting towards the end, but I would like to throw that around. Where is it led from? Where are these governance rules led from? And that was probably my question to you, Sherry. You know, do you have that ethics officer inside the organization? And if so, where do they report? Because that's important. I think, you know, that's a self-regulated environment.
I think, Paul, maybe two perspectives. One is from a Google perspective, just like sustainability, innovation, you know, ethics in AI and data privacy and protection is embedded into everyone's responsibility from day one we onboard to the company. It's trained because you don't want to kind of like put it in the arms of one person. Of course, we set very clear policy, but it should be embedded and built into every single one. For us, every Googler's responsibility to ensure that we hold ourselves to the highest standards of ethics when it comes to data protection, privacy, AI. So that's one. In terms of the metaverse, I would say that because it's at very nascent stage, I think just like Shiv put it, right, I think that it requires a lot of conversation between industry and the governments and some governing, you know, technology body. Unfortunately, the conversation and the dialogue is required to get everybody aligned into providing a safe and secure environment where innovation can thrive. We know the dangers when you let things run on its own, you know, with speed. That is sometimes a consideration for, you know, what is sustainable. To build a sustainable, you know, immersive, enjoyable environment where industry and economics can thrive, I think that dialogue and alignment across industry and governing bodies needs to be in place.
I agree. I completely agree. Yeah, Shiv, yeah, give us a quick response to that.
Sorry, this is almost a little bit. It's not quite a response. It's just actually, Paul. Do you want to come back to me? I'll make another point.
Yeah, I'll come back. I do. I'm very much, Sherry. The thing is, it's hard, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And you know, I know myself and my universities, and I'm sure Doctor in Sydney there. The universities are trying to put these ethical concerns all over the place. I'm going to move on to a couple of questions. So if you want to come back in, Shrew, then please do, or Anthony. But I'm going to move on to our questions now because we've had a very intense debate here. I've really enjoyed it, actually. It's the light is happening in England. So do you want to come back, Shrew, quickly?
Yeah, I was just going to say this, which is, it's on obviously on the topics of ethics. You know, all of this is, as Sherry has said, like it's very early stage, right? So you're asking yourself constantly, I guess, what do you want to see, rather than what should be the case, because this two are so closely connected, right at the beginning. And maybe it would also be this, which is an appeal for a commons that can be creative and unbounded, right? Because as soon as you want to sort of commercialize a metaverse, you know, we have now the tools from blockchain and Web3 to say, okay, well, look, this you know, this skin that you've got is now an NFT, and we can sell that. Great. The other way of looking at it is, well, why not just have a million things and a million options? Because actually, it's all generative. We can totally do it. There's, you know, there's a place called Decentraland, and you know the way that it's divvied up is it is a metaverse in that sense, and you create your own little plot of land, but you have to kind of pay for the privilege to be in that space. Well, actually, that's just a construction. It's like taking all the wrongs of the world and social construction and saying, fine, let's just import that into a digital sphere, and let's say, okay, now you have to pay to be into this club, right? And you're like, great, okay, we're just back to square one again in terms of those kind of equity, ethical issues, right? Because obviously, how we run these social systems butts up against or ethics all the time, pure ethics.
Yeah, so I don't think we're going to solve this problem on this call. We haven't got time. We've only got 5 minutes left. Mind you, we could do, but I'd really like to just throw a few of the questions out from our audience out there. Some really interesting ones, and anybody can jump in and say what they think about this. I'm going to combine two of the questions. Humans have 5 basic senses. Do we think we will have more senses in the metaverse?
No.
I'll give you an example of this. Let me give you an example of this. A very good friend of mine, who I've had this discussion with many times, and he did a podcast for us. Chris Lewis, who is blind. And when I first started talking about the metaverse, he said, "Can I see in the metaverse, please, Paul?" Now that was a really, really interesting question. And I said to him, "Well, at the moment you can't even see through the goggles." Because you can't see. And he said, "No, but I can tune the world through other senses. So, make sure that we don't disadvantage people in that case." So I thought I'd just throw that out there. Is there more than once? Is there another sense that happens? But the next question is something which, sorry, Shiv, you were going to say?
No, I was just going to say time would be the other sense. That might get screwed around by the metaverse in really interesting ways. Yeah.
Very good. Doctor, yes?
Yeah, I was going to say that we probably might not add another sense, which probably impossible, but our sense will be sharper in metaverse. Okay, right now we can see 10 feet away, but in metaverse we might see 100 feet away, and then we can see tiny vibration in 10 feet away with metaverse.
Exactly, and that's what Chris said to me. My other senses are much more attuned to the world that I live in, and I would have to completely learn that all again if I go into the metaverse. So that was one question. I'll ask one more question, which is really interesting, and thank you very much whoever put this in. Humans grow old. One day we're going to die, but can we exist in the metaverse beyond that? And will it become overpopulated? Anthony.
It's fascinating. I mean, look, it's already a problem in social media, right? Because people have very complex and integrated presences on Facebook and other places. I've started to see, I'm not that old, but I'm starting to get older, and I'm starting to see older friends beginning to pass away, and obituaries on LinkedIn and things like that. So, and you start to see, okay, well, how do you manage that sort of that end of life thing? So, will it get overpopulated? Well, I mean, technically no, but will it get complicated to manage the removal of identities and presences? Certainly, aging data is a challenge, but I don't think it's going to be an insurmountable problem. I think we will have to address it, and I think we will. Just one other point, just on the previous question. I think to back up what Kanchana said, it is a superpower, right? The metaverse is a superpower. It's not really an extra sense, but it means that we can see further. My glasses are a superpower, right? If I didn't have these glasses, I wouldn't be able to see as far as that screen. My iPad here in front of me means I can see all the way to Sri Lanka. That's a superpower. So these technologies, the metaverse, are superpowers. They enhance our senses.
Great, yeah. So. Okay, anybody else want to chip in on the overpopulation of the metaverse?
I wouldn't say overpopulation of the metaverse, but I agree with Anthony on the point of how our senses are sharpened, and I think metaverse will provide an opportunity for accessibility that otherwise physically we can't. Just for example, right? Degree partnered recently with Decentraland run a race or a virtual race, for people of all sorts of disabilities, and they can actually participate and experience that through the avatars, and get a sense of what it means to be in, a marathon, for example. And I think that's beautiful, a work of inclusion.
Great, yeah. Shiv, yeah.
The economist J.K. Galbraith had a book called The Affluent Society, which was all about what are we going to do when there's so much stuff in the world, right? Because we've cracked productivity in all sorts of ways. We might not be there in the physical world, but from the metaverse's perspective, no, we should have full digital abundance. That was the point that I was kind of making before, right? What are the constraints on digital abundance? Very, very few, just like electricity and imagination, really. And some devs.
Great. So, that leads us probably towards the end. We've got I did want to talk about transhumanization. Where does this take us with AI? But I'll leave that for a different conversation. If anybody wants to think about that, here is a good book, which is AI Ethics by Mark Koppelberg. Really interesting view. Really interesting view from a philosophy point of view. But anyway, I'm not plugging that book out there, Anthony. Okay, well, I'd like to end this by thanking the panelists here. What a fantastic discussion. Really had my brain working and my metaverse working. So thank you very much and for sharing these thoughts with us. And in the words of William Shakespeare from one of his plays, Julius Caesar, and I'm sure William Shakespeare would have loved to be in the metaverse. So to the audience, thank you for lending me your ears.
Wow, it has sparked a true debate on the topic, isn't it, Pragesh?
Definitely with me.
Thank you, Professor Paul, for moderating the discussion, and thank you to our great panelists, Anthony, Dr. Kanchana, Shiv, and Sherry, for sharing your expertise with our audience.
Thank you very much.